Hi, folks. You're Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. Now, in this essay, I'd like to talk about going back to the US civil rights, or black civil rights, as it's sometimes called, movement in the United States that began probably in the late 50s, I suppose, but kept on going through into the 1960s, including the end part of the Eisenhower administration into the Kennedy and onto the Johnson, and even was still going in varying forms and intensities during the Nixon years, the years of the Nixon presidency. So let's have a look at that. Now, before I start this, I want to sort of cast your minds to the Colorado baker. So this guy who owns a small suburban bakery, and he was targeted ruthlessly and relentlessly by the LGBT community, who with very cashed up lawyers harassed him, and on the basis that he wouldn't adorn a cake for LGBTQ people. Now, just to give you an idea what a sort of a fine line that the LGBTQ activists were drawing, you could go into this guy's shop and buy any cake you wanted, off the shelf, and if you wanted him to bake a cake, he would happily do it. He didn't care. You were a paying customer. The only color he saw was green, and so. But if you wanted to put specific LGBTQ adornments, writing on the cake, then he wouldn't do that on the basis that it was against his Christian beliefs. But you could buy any cake or have any cake. He'd bake you any cake. It was just the icing and the adornment on the icing. Now, just on that alone, they went after you on the basis of some interpretation of discrimination or homophobia or something or other, and took it all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Now, fortunately, this baker was able to find financial support from various Christian groups, and so as the two sides squared off, both sides were very well cashed up, and both sides were determined to duke it out to the bitter end. And finally, the Christians won, or part one, I suppose. I wouldn't call it a sweeping total victory. Nonetheless, so now let's come back to the 1960s. Now, the claim was that blacks weren't allowed to vote. They were prevented from voting, and any documentaries or supposed or alleged documentaries you see today, when they say blacks weren't allowed to vote, they'll be straight to Nazis, swastikas, Hitler, the Ku Klux Klan, burning crosses, black people being lynched from every tree. They'll go straight to that. Now, it's far more nuanced than that. It wasn't that way at all. Black people could vote and did vote, and weren't that way at all. Black people could vote and did vote and were voting. Now, there were certain districts in the Deep South, particularly the rural areas, but there were certain districts where you could reasonably argue that not many of these districts, by the way, but you could reasonably argue that US black citizens were being prevented from voting, or that attempts to enroll to vote were being frustrated or hampered or obstructed in some way. Now, one of the ways of doing that was that typically the blacks in rural areas had really no high school, or maybe a year of high school at best, and maybe even a few years of primary school. So they're pretty much illiterate, and therefore they were required to read or write a certain short dissertation or something. They were given some sort of test or series of tests to determine their literacy, and the majority of them failed it and failed comprehensively. So on that basis, the people handling the voter rolls and voter enrollment processes could say, well, this guy's illiterate. The bylaw here is that if you can't read or write, then you can't vote, and these sorts of things. So all those types of mechanisms were used to prevent black citizens from enrolling. Yeah, they were used from time to time, for white citizens, but generally the black citizens in those particular areas. There weren't that many, but it was there. So when the activists talk about we weren't allowed to vote, those damn Nazis and Ku Klux Klan, and they carry on like that, they're really talking about a very small sort of number of counties and places in certain areas. And when there was a big voter enrollment sort of program for blacks, through the Civil Rights Acts, particularly say, when the civil rights legislation, upheld by the Supreme Court, by the way, when it was challenged, the civil rights legislation, say around 1965, so no obstacles to black people enrolling to vote were there. They were removed completely, and there were activist Jewish lawyers, running around all over the place to help Southern blacks enroll to vote. So how many blacks would you, given they've been held back by evil Hitler, Nazi, Ku Klux Klan, racist, fascist, swastika, given they've been held back, well, there must be millions, tens of millions, many tens of millions, wanting to vote that weren't allowed to, clamoring for the franchise. So how many people across the whole, as I understand this, the whole of the deep racist, fascist, Nazi, Ku Klux Klan South, how many blacks enrolled to vote once they were clearly able to? And once again, there were armies of Jewish lawyers running around helping them. So the number of blacks that enrolled to vote that were supposedly being oppressed and held back and evil, right? 4,000. 4,000. That was it across the whole, just by my understanding at least, across the whole of the, so a tiny number of black people were enrolling to vote. Now, that could have been that they didn't want to vote, they didn't care. It could be that there wasn't many that gave a shit. And, there could have been a number of reasons. Maybe they were a long way from voting booths or something. Maybe they had a long way to travel. Maybe the activists just couldn't still. So there's a small nucleus of activists, and to them it was important. But they could have moved to another county or whatever and voted there. So they weren't actually prevented from voting. It was only in those few areas where they were being obstructed, and that, as illustrated by the small number of blacks that ended up enrolling to vote. The idea that blacks en masse were stopped from voting prevented of Jim Crow, but then Hitler, that's bullshit. Bullshit. Were there places where it happened? Yes. I mean, there's no disputing that. But the idea of some widespread, uniform, blanket, 100% oppression and prevention, no black could vote anywhere ever, that is absolutely not an outrageous untruth. So we need to sort of put that in some perspective. That supposedly millions upon millions of blacks were prevented from vote, but when they were given the right to vote and backed up by Supreme Court verdicts and all this sort of stuff, federal troops running around, everything, only 4,000 bothered to enroll to vote over that time. So it is when we really look at it like that, we can see what a very small problem. Well, was it amplified? Should it have happened? Well, of course not. They're US citizens. They should have the right to vote like any other US citizen. But the idea that there's some huge major problem across America, that's simply nonsense. It's simply not true. Now, there's a guy called, I think it was James Meredith off the top of my head, but he at the age of, I think, 25 or 26, somewhere, mid-20s, to enroll in, so it's claimed, he wanted to enroll in university. Now, he could have gone to university. There are hundreds of universities across the United States that he could have gone to. He only wanted to do like sociology, so it wasn't like it was a high-powered heavyweight course. Now it was. I can't find any clear. I can't find any clear information about the grades he got. So supposedly he was a good high school student who got good grades, but then it also seems that he dropped out at a young age and went to join the U.S. Armed Forces as some sort of a trainee or apprenticeship of some sort. He served in the armed forces, I think, for about 10 years, give or take. And so how can a kid that dropped out of junior high school also have got incredibly good results in senior high school? Because they claim he was this really good student. So he didn't graduate to university. So he was going to university as like a what's called in Australia at least a mature age student, that is over the age of 18 or 19. And he's got he served as now I don't know what capacity precisely he served the his country in the armed forces. This was before Vietnam kicked off. So nonetheless, he served his country in the United States military, and so that alone should count for something, I would have thought. But anyway, there were hundreds of universities he could go to, but him and the activists, and he's right in the epicenter of the super activists, crowd. The black activist groups, again heavily supported by Jewish lawyers and activist groups and communist groups and so on. Lots of communists around them. So he decides, or I'm sure he was set up for it. I mean, again, he could have gone to hundreds of universities around the US, but instead he finds a university in the Deep South that does not accept black students. This is an all-white university. And that's where he has to go to that university, not the hundreds of others he could go to without any drama or fuss or bother. That one is where he has to go. And so they the activists all lined up for a big showdown. Now, at this time, the Kennedy administration, President Kennedy administration, they were desperate to show their leftist sort of we're into civil rights, we support the black people, and so they were desperate for the optics, absolutely gagging and desperate for the optics. So they sort of couldn't back away from this, and that it was done without any coordination, I can't believe. But the amount of groups that were coordinating, through the media and so on, and again trying to portray this black guy who wanted to enroll and trying to portray that he wasn't getting in there, that it was Hitler, it's Ku Klux Klan, it was fascists, it was there's this idea, this depiction that was of course wholly unrealistic and quite absurd. Nonetheless, now they talk about it now, the activists, when they talk about it, or even at the time, but particularly now, they frame it in white supremacy and Hitler, and they really overdo that bit way too much. But this young man, who again was mid-20s, Meredith, he was, I think, unwillingly put up to it. He was the stalking horse. He was the fall guy, and it was fairly clear that given how temperatures were rising on all sides, by the way, that his life was in danger, as indeed were others in and around this sort of thing. Now, there were various riots and so on, and only the riots where white people were opposing blacks coming to this university, only those are shown. All the riots and the dramas and the stabbings and the beatings that blacks inflicted, that's all been sort of taken out, washed out of the narrative. And today you just have the assumption there were just this mass band of Nazis running around trying to stop, which was untrue, totally untrue. But again, the issue is that there was a handful of universities in America that didn't accept black students, and that's where this guy has to go. He could have easily gone to university. Nothing was stopping this kid from going to university, this young man from going to university, but they chose to make a huge issue out of it, I think, for all the wrong reasons, and it created massive confrontation and drama, and time would have solved this anyway, and time would have eventually, this university would have accepted black students. So we've got a black kid with I assume very ordinary grades that didn't actually make it into university, but because of his military service, because he's black, he wants to go into it. Now they give him a nice haircut, dress him up in a sharp suit. You go, there, see, that's how Nazi these people are. Look what a clean cut kid this dude. So they did all the optics. It's quite well matched, by the way. So they had the optics, I think, on their side, particularly given that the media were quite helpful in depicting the white people as the bad guys, and black people as having a reasonable cause. But no one asked him the question, not that I could find, again, I think his name's Meredith. Mr. Meredith, you can go to there are 125 universities across America that would happily accept you studying this course. Why don't you go to one of them? Why must it be just this university and no other? Why are you doing this? Are you out to create trouble or something? Now they could make a big equality, and I'm fighting racism, and I'm fighting Hitler. And they could do all that sort of stuff. The reality is, this was purposefully picked to create as much drama and as much conflict as possible. So the idea again that black people couldn't attend university, which is widely put about in the propaganda today, is simply not true. Same goes for there were places around America where black kids could go to white high school, primarily white high schools. But again, they'll pick the handful of high schools that don't do that and say, well, that's the bad thing we can. So there's a tiniest corner, and it's very communist, this, and very communist agitator style. If there's even one tiny little corner of the world anywhere where there's, a black person can't vote or can't go to university, the tiniest, the most irrelevant place in the middle of nowhere, then that becomes the whole epicenter, the whole focus of the activism. Because in the communist mind, if there's one idea that remains that you don't like, then that idea is a constant danger that could flare up at any time. That's their perception of things. And so every idea has to be read, which is why the communists engage in mass murder on an unimaginable scale. Well, these people have the wrong idea. We're allowed to kill them. We're allowed to kill them off by the tens of millions. And this is the same ideological attitude they have in activism. Well, there's a university there that doesn't allow this. We have to kill it off. We have to do it. We have to portray them all as being Hitler. And so when you look at this going back to this time, they were deliberately picking targets, such as the only university that doesn't, or the only county that restricts voting. And so they were finding these very few places and attempting to amplify those to a level that would suggest or imply or would assert that this was happening everywhere all across the United States. Now, they do the same thing today, that tactical sort of approach to ideological tyranny is still being practiced today and aided and abetted by the media today, so that a trans person will go to a suburban bar in a white working class area where they know there's only males in the bar, and they'll go into that place and with huge exhibitionism we'll walk around up and down, back and forth, all around, go to the women's bathroom, and a trans guy will try and use the bathroom, and they'll do all that sort of stuff. And if anyone complains or says anything, then that's it, that the entire force of the activist ideological law will come down on those. Activist ideological law will come down on those, and they've got a scalp, and they've got a headline, and they've got a legal precedent. And so their tactics today are almost exactly the same as they were then. And with this little grounds, the Colorado baker that wouldn't adorn the cake with LGBTQ slogans, for example, that person could have gone to any other bakery in town and got what they wanted, but no, they had to get that one. And again, that was what was going on in the 1960s and the activism, and we need to understand that was their tactic, and that was how they got the headlines. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.